When a desperate widower spent his last $100 on 3 Chinese girls at an 1867 Nebraska auction, the townspeople expected scandal. But what Edmund Pierce did next would challenge everything they believed about family, dignity, and the true meaning of worth. Could 3 strangers with nothing but courage and determination save not just a failing store, but an entire community's soul? The rattlesnake coiled in the corner of Edmund Pierce's empty grain barrel wasn't the worst thing he'd discovered that morning. The 42-year-old store owner carefully backed away from the hissing serpent, his boots crunching on scattered corn kernels that represented his dwindling hope. Outside his Nebraska shop, the October wind of 1867 howled like a banshee, but inside, the silence felt even more deadly. Edmund's weathered hands shook as he counted the coins in his leather pouch for the 3rd time. $57.32. That was all that stood between him and losing everything Martha had worked so hard to build. The general store on Maple Street had been their dream, their future, their legacy. Now it felt more like a tomb filled with memories he couldn't afford to keep. The bell above his door chimed, and Mrs. Henderson shuffled in, her gray shawl pulled tight against the autumn chill. She moved slowly between the half-empty shelves, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Edmund knew what she saw. Dust on the medicine bottles, gaps where flour sacks should have been, cobwebs in corners that Martha would never have allowed. "Morning, Edmund," she said, her voice gentle but concerned. "Heard you might be heading to the auction house today." Word traveled fast in small towns. Edmund nodded, not trusting his voice. The Omaha auction house was where desperate people went to buy and sell whatever they could. Livestock, furniture, sometimes even people who owed debts they couldn't pay. He'd never imagined he'd be walking through those doors as anything other than a curious observer. "Martha wouldn't want you to give up," Mrs. Henderson continued, selecting a small bag of sugar from his depleted stock. "That woman believed in this store something fierce." The mention of his wife's name hit Edmund like a physical blow. 6 months had passed since the fever took her, but the pain still felt fresh as an open wound. Martha had been the heart of their business, keeping the books, remembering every customer's preferences, making their little store feel like the center of the community. Without her, Edmund felt like a ship without an anchor, drifting toward rocks he couldn't avoid. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "The suppliers want cash up front now. Johnson's Bank won't extend my credit. And winter's coming fast." Mrs. Henderson paid for her sugar with exact change, then patted his arm with surprising strength. "Sometimes the answer comes from places we never expect to look." After she left, Edmund stared at the snake still coiled in his grain barrel. Even the rattler seemed to mock him, comfortable in its new home among the ruins of his dreams. He grabbed his father's old walking stick and carefully guided the serpent out the back door, watching it slither away into the tall grass behind his store. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could remove a dangerous snake from his shop, but he couldn't drive away the poisonous despair that had taken root in his heart. By noon, the October sun had burned away the morning frost, but Edmund still felt cold inside as he hitched his horse to the wagon. The 15-mile journey to Omaha would give him time to think, though thinking was the last thing he wanted to do. Every mile took him closer to a decision he wasn't sure he could live with. The auction house sat on the outskirts of town like a hungry beast, its weathered wooden walls echoing with the sounds of commerce and desperation. Edmund had attended a few auctions over the years, usually looking for tools or equipment for the store. He'd seen men bid on everything from prize bulls to family heirlooms, their faces showing the full range of human emotion: greed, hope, disappointment, victory. Today felt different. Today he was one of them. The crowd inside was larger than usual, filled with ranchers, merchants, and speculators from across the territory. The air smelled of tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else Edmund couldn't quite identify: the scent of lives being bought and sold. He found a spot near the back, hoping to observe without being noticed. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that could carry across a battlefield, worked through the morning's lots with practiced efficiency. A team of oxen sold for $80. A set of china dishes brought $15. A worn saddle went for $12 to a cowboy who looked like he'd been sleeping rough for weeks. Edmund's attention drifted until he heard something that made his blood run cold. Next lot, 3 Chinese girls, ages 12 to 16, brought from San Francisco by wagon train. Previous owner vouches for their work ethic and domestic skills. They're experienced in cooking, cleaning, and basic bookkeeping. Quiet dispositions, no trouble with previous employers. The warehouse fell silent except for the creak of settling timber. Edmund's stomach churned as 3 small figures were pushed onto the raised platform. They moved with careful, measured steps, their silk slippers making no sound on the rough wooden boards. The oldest stood slightly in front of the other 2, her back straight despite the circumstances. She couldn't have been more than 16, but her dark eyes held a strength that reminded Edmund painfully of Martha during her final days, proud even when facing the impossible. The middle girl, perhaps 14, kept her gaze fixed on the floor, while the youngest, barely 12 by the look of her, seemed to draw courage from her older companions. These girls come with a bill of sale and transportation papers, the auctioneer continued, his voice betraying no emotion. They speak some English and are said to be quick learners. Bidding starts at $50 for the lot. Edmund felt sick. He'd heard about such auctions but had never witnessed one. The idea of human beings standing on a platform like livestock violated everything he'd been raised to believe. Yet here they were, 3 children whose fate would be decided by whoever had the most money and the least conscience. $50, called out a voice from the front. Edmund craned his neck to see a heavy-set man in expensive clothes, his face showing the kind of smile that made decent people look away. $60, came another bid, this one from a rancher Edmund recognized from previous auctions. The price climbed slowly. $70, $75, $80. With each bid, Edmund watched the oldest girl's face, seeing the way her jaw tightened with determination even as her situation grew more desperate. At $90, the bidding slowed. The heavy-set man seemed confident he would win, already counting money from a thick roll of bills. The rancher shook his head and stepped back, apparently reaching his limit. $90, going once, the auctioneer called. Edmund's heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the crowd noise. He thought of Martha, of the empty store, of the future he'd planned that now seemed impossible. He thought of the rattlesnake he'd removed from his grain barrel that morning, and how sometimes you had to act before you had time to think about consequences. Going twice. The oldest girl lifted her chin slightly, and in that gesture, Edmund saw something that cut through his despair like sunlight through storm clouds. She wasn't just accepting her fate. She was facing it with a dignity that shamed every adult in that room. Without fully understanding why, Edmund felt his hand rise into the air. $100. The words burst from Edmund's throat like they'd been trapped there for months, surprising him almost as much as they shocked the crowded warehouse. Every head in the auction house turned toward him, creating a wave of whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. The heavy-set man at the front spun around, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. The auctioneer paused, his gavel frozen halfway to the block, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Edmund's legs felt weak as he realized what he'd just done. $100 was more money than he'd seen in weeks, representing nearly every cent he had left in the world. His logical mind screamed that he'd just made a terrible mistake, but something deeper kept him standing tall despite the stares. "Did I hear correctly?" the auctioneer asked, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. $100 from the gentleman in the back. "You heard right," Edmund replied, his voice stronger than he felt inside. The heavy-set man took a step forward, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. "I'll bid 110, he called out, his tone suggesting this was now personal rather than business. Edmund's mouth went dry. He didn't have $110. He barely had the 100 he'd already bid. But as he looked at the 3 girls on the platform, he saw something that made his decision easy. The oldest girl was looking directly at him now, and in her eyes he saw not just hope, but a kind of recognition, as if she understood that his bid came from something other than the usual reasons men bought human beings. "I'm sorry," Edmund said loudly enough for everyone to hear. $100 is my final offer. If it's not enough, then I wish these young ladies the best of luck with whoever wins. The warehouse fell completely silent. In auction houses, you didn't set limits on your bidding. You fought until you won or until you couldn't afford to continue. Edmund's declaration broke the unwritten rules of the game, but it also did something else. It showed everyone present that his interest wasn't driven by the same motivations as the other bidders. The heavy-set man laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. 110, he repeated, pulling out his thick roll of bills. These girls will work hard for their keep. The way he said work made Edmund's skin crawl. He thought of Martha, of how she'd always said that people showed their true character when they had power over others. This man's character was showing clearly, and Edmund didn't like what he saw. Going once at $110, the auctioneer called. Edmund closed his eyes, feeling defeat wash over him like cold water. He tried to do something right, something Martha would have been proud of, but good intentions couldn't stretch money he didn't have. Actually, came a clear voice from the platform. We would prefer to work for the gentleman who bid $100. Everyone turned to stare at the oldest girl, who had stepped forward despite the shocked gasps from the crowd. She stood straight and tall, her voice carrying clearly through the warehouse despite her youth. You can't choose your buyer, the auctioneer sputtered, clearly flustered by this unprecedented development. That's not how auctions work. But we can refuse to work, she replied calmly, and we can make life very difficult for someone who buys us against our wishes. The heavy-set man's face turned red. They're bluffing. They'll work for whoever owns them, or they'll face the consequences. Sir, the girl said, turning to face him directly. You seem like a man who values getting his money's worth. Do you really want to pay $110 for 3 girls who will burn your food, break your dishes, and find ways to cost you far more than you paid? A few people in the crowd actually chuckled at her boldness. The heavy-set man looked around, realizing that the situation had somehow turned against him. He'd been outmaneuvered by a 16-year-old girl who had no power except her own intelligence and courage. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but Edmund could see him calculating in his head. A workforce that actively worked against you was worse than no workforce at all. The auctioneer looked completely lost. In all his years of conducting sales, he'd never encountered anything like this. That is, the procedures don't cover. I withdraw my bid, the heavy-set man announced suddenly. Let someone else deal with these troublemakers. A collective breath seemed to escape from the crowd. The auctioneer looked around desperately, hoping someone else would step forward to complicate matters further, but the warehouse remained quiet. Sold to Mr. I'm sorry, what was your name, sir? Pierce, Edmund replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Edmund Pierce. As he walked forward to complete the transaction, Edmund felt like he was moving through a dream. His legs carried him toward the platform where 3 young strangers waited, their faces showing a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He pulled out his leather pouch and counted out every dollar he owned, plus the coins needed to reach exactly $100. The paperwork was simple but official. The auctioneer handed him a bill of sale that made Edmund's stomach turn, a document that legally classified 3 human beings as his property. He folded the paper quickly and stuffed it into his jacket pocket, hoping he'd never have to look at it again. You girls ready to go? He asked, unsure of the proper way to address his new employees, servants. The whole situation felt wrong, but he couldn't think of a better word. The oldest girl nodded and helped her companions down from the platform. Up close, Edmund could see that their clothes, while clean, showed signs of hard wear. Their shoes were thin silk slippers completely unsuitable for prairie weather. The youngest girl shivered slightly in the autumn air, and Edmund realized they probably had no warm clothing for the coming winter. My name's Mei Lin, the oldest girl said as they walked toward the warehouse exit. This is Li Hua, she gestured to the middle girl, and Xiao Yu is our youngest. Edmund Pierce, he replied. I own a general store in town. That's where you'll be. Where you'll work. Mr. Pierce, Mei Lin said. stopping just outside the auction house doors. "Why did you buy us?" It was a fair question, and one Edmund wasn't sure he could answer honestly. He looked at the three faces watching him expectantly and tried to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. "I saw the way you stood up there," he said finally. "Reminded me of someone who was very important to me. Someone who never backed down from doing what was right, even when it was hard." Li Hua, who had been quiet until now, spoke up in carefully pronounced English. "Your wife?" The simple question hit Edmund harder than he expected. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "She died," Xiao Yu asked gently. "6 months ago," Edmund managed. "Fever took her quick." The three girls exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Mei Lin spoke again. "We are sorry for your loss, Mr. Pierce, and we are grateful for what you did in there. We will work hard for you, but we need you to understand something." Edmund waited, sensing this conversation would determine how the next weeks or months would unfold. "We are not slaves," Mei Lin continued firmly. "The papers you bought may say you own us, but in our hearts we belong to ourselves. We will work faithfully and honestly, but we will not be treated as property. Is this acceptable?" Edmund looked at this slip of a girl who had just negotiated the terms of her own servitude with more dignity than most adults he knew. Behind her, Li Hua and Xiao Yu watched him with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "More than acceptable," he said. "It's exactly what Martha would have wanted to hear." As they walked toward his wagon, Edmund realized that his impulsive decision at the auction had changed more than just his financial situation. For the first time in 6 months, he wasn't thinking about his own problems. Instead, he found himself wondering how 3 young strangers were going to survive a Nebraska winter, and what he could do to help them. The wagon ride back to town would give them all time to figure out what came next. Li Hua discovered the hidden fortune on her second day at Pierce's general store, buried beneath a mountain of crumpled papers that Edmund had been too heartbroken to organize since Martha's death. "Mr. Pierce," she called out, her voice echoing from behind the wooden counter where she'd been sorting through 6 months of neglected bookkeeping. "People owe you $437. Edmund dropped the broom he'd been using to sweep the front porch, the wooden handle clattering against the boards. He rushed inside, certain he'd misheard the 14-year-old girl who had spent the morning transforming his chaotic record-keeping into neat, organized columns. "That can't be right," he said, leaning over her shoulder to examine the ledger. "Most folks around here pay what they owe." Li Hua pointed to page after page of entries, her finger tracing lines of Martha's careful handwriting followed by months of Edmund's scattered notes. "Mrs. Johnson, $12 for medicine. Mr. Watson, $23 for winter supplies. The Miller family, $18 for flour and beans." Each name Li Hua read aloud hit Edmund like a small shock. These were his neighbors, people he saw at church every Sunday, families whose children played in the street outside his store. He'd been so focused on his grief that he'd stopped keeping track of who owed what, trusting that good people would remember their debts without being reminded. "Some of these go back 4 months, Li Hua continued, her young face serious as she calculated figures in her head faster than Edmund could follow. "If even half these people pay what they owe, you can restock the store for winter." From across the room, Mei Lin looked up from the shelves she'd been dusting with strips of cloth torn from old flour sacks. "In San Francisco, my father always said that kindness without boundaries becomes weakness." Edmund felt heat rise in his cheeks. The idea of asking neighbors for money they owed felt somehow shameful, like admitting he'd failed as both a businessman and a friend. Martha had handled the delicate task of collecting overdue accounts, always managing to get paid without making people feel uncomfortable. "These are good people going through hard times," he said defensively. "They'll pay when they can." "Good people pay their debts," Mei Lin replied quietly. "People who take advantage of kindness are not good people." Xiao Yu, who had been quietly organizing the medicine bottles by size and type, spoke up from her corner. "Maybe some forgot? We could remind them nicely." Her gentle suggestion offered a middle path that Edmund hadn't considered. Instead of demanding payment like an angry creditor, they could simply remind people of amounts owed, giving them a chance to make things right without losing face. What would Martha think? Li Hua asked suddenly, her question cutting straight to the heart of Edmund's hesitation. The answer came immediately and clearly. Martha would have marched right up to every single person on that list and asked for her money with a smile that made refusal impossible. She'd always said that running a business meant being fair to everyone. Customers who needed credit and shopkeepers who needed to get paid. She'd tell me to stop being foolish and collect what's owed, Edmund admitted. Then we help you, Mei Lin declared. Li Hua makes the list of who owes what. Xiao Yu and I clean the store until it shines like new. And you practice asking for money without looking like you want to apologize for it. The next 3 days transformed Pierce's general store in ways Edmund hadn't thought possible. Li Hua attacked the account books like a general planning a military campaign, creating detailed records of every transaction and organizing overdue accounts by size and how long they'd been outstanding. Her ability with numbers amazed Edmund. She could add columns of figures in her head faster than he could with pencil and paper. Mei Lin and Xiao Yu worked from dawn until dusk, scrubbing every surface, organizing inventory, and making the store look more professional than it had since Martha's final illness. They moved with efficient purpose, each girl taking responsibility for different areas while somehow managing to coordinate their efforts perfectly. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Henderson returned on Thursday afternoon and stopped dead in her tracks just inside the door. "Good gracious," she breathed, looking around the transformed space. "This place looks like it did when Martha first opened." Edmund felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. The girls had somehow captured the spirit of how the store used to feel. Welcoming, organized, and full of everything a family might need. "We've been working hard," he said, gesturing toward Li Hua behind the counter, and Mei Lin arranging canned goods on freshly cleaned shelves. Mrs. Henderson approached the counter where Li Hua sat with the reorganized account books spread before her. "You must be one of the girls Edmund hired." "Yes, ma'am," Li Hua replied politely. "I help with the numbers." "The numbers?" Edmund took a deep breath. "Mrs. Henderson, according to our records, your account shows a balance of $8.50. I know times have been tough, but I was wondering if you might be able to make a payment toward what you owe." He'd practiced the words dozens of times over the past 3 days, and they still felt awkward in his mouth. But Mrs. Henderson's reaction surprised him completely. "Oh my stars," she said, pulling out a small coin purse. "I had no idea it had gotten so high. Of course I can pay. I should have asked about my balance months ago." She counted out exact change and handed it to Li Hua, who carefully recorded the payment in her ledger. "Thank you for keeping such good records. It's embarrassing when you lose track of what you owe good people." After Mrs. Henderson left, Edmund stared at the money in his hand like it had appeared by magic. "That was easier than I expected. People want to pay their debts," Mei Lin observed from her position reorganizing the hardware section. "They just need to be reminded politely." The pattern repeated itself over the next week. Customer after customer, when approached respectfully about overdue accounts, responded with embarrassment and immediate payment. Some paid in full, others made partial payments with promises to pay the rest soon. A few showed genuine surprise at how much they owed, but nobody got angry or refused to acknowledge their debt. Mr. Watson, the farmer who owed $23, paid $15 on the spot and promised the rest after he sold his corn harvest. The Miller family, struggling with a sick father, paid what they could and worked out a plan to pay the rest in monthly installments. Only one customer reacted badly to being asked for payment. "You're dunning me for money now?" Sheriff Walsh demanded when Edmund approached him about his $14 debt. "Since when do you chase after folks for every penny?" "Since I realized I need to keep the store open," Edmund replied, his voice steady despite the sheriff's aggressive tone. "The account is 4 months overdue." Walsh looked around the transformed store, his eyes settling on Mei Lin and Xiao Yu, who continued working despite the tension. "I see you've got your new help whipping you into shape. Shame to see a man taking orders from foreigners." The insult hit Edmund like a slap, but before he could respond, Li Hua spoke up from behind the counter. "Sheriff Walsh, Would you prefer to pay your account in full today? Or would you like to arrange a payment plan like we offered the Miller family? Her calm, professional tone somehow made Walsh's bluster seem petty and childish. He threw $14 on the counter with unnecessary force and stalked out, but not before muttering something under his breath about people who don't know their place. That man is trouble, Mei Lin said quietly after Walsh left. Edmund nodded, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Walsh's hostility went beyond simple embarrassment about an overdue account. There was something darker in his attitude, something that made Edmund worry about what might happen when the sheriff decided to act on his obvious resentment. But for now, they had money in the cash box, organized records, and a store that looked like a real business again. Li Hua's discovery of the forgotten debts had given them hope, but Edmund sensed that their success was about to create new problems they hadn't anticipated. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, and Edmund wondered if they'd have time to prepare for the storms ahead, both the weather and the humankind. The brick shattered Edmund's front window at 3 in the morning, sending glass fragments across the floor where Xiaoyu had been sleeping just hours before. Edmund bolted upright from his cot behind the counter, his heart hammering as he tried to make sense of the crash that had jolted him from deep sleep. Moonlight streamed through the jagged hole where his window used to be, illuminating the brick that now lay among scattered shards near the medicine display. Mr. Pierce. Mei Lin's voice came from the small alcove where the girls slept. Are you hurt? Stay back there, Edmund called, grabbing his boots and stepping carefully around the broken glass. Don't come out until I check what happened. He picked up the brick with shaking hands, immediately noticing the paper tied around it with rough twine. His fingers fumbled with the knots as he unfolded what looked like a torn piece of brown wrapping paper. Someone had scrawled a message in crude letters. Send them back where they came from or face the consequences. The threat hit Edmund harder than the broken window. For 2 weeks, he'd been lulling himself into thinking that the success of collecting overdue accounts meant their troubles were over. The store was thriving, customers were paying their bills, and the girls had transformed his failing business into something Martha would have been proud of. But now reality crashed through his window as surely as the brick had. What does it say? Li Hua asked, appearing at his elbow despite his warning to stay hidden. Edmund tried to shield the paper from her view, but she was too quick. Her eyes scanned the threatening words, and he watched her face change from curiosity to understanding to something that looked like resignation. We should leave, she said quietly. We are bringing danger to you. Absolutely not, Edmund replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. This is your home now. We don't let bullies make our decisions for us. Mei Lin joined them, carefully stepping around the glass in her bare feet. In San Francisco, we learned that running away from threats only makes them follow you to new places. But staying might get Mr. Pierce hurt, Xiaoyu pointed out, her young voice heavy with worry. What if next time they do more than break windows? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Edmund looked at the 3 girls who had worked so hard to save his store, and realized that his impulsive decision at the auction had put them all in a situation none of them had anticipated. We need to think about this carefully, he said, folding the threatening note and putting it in his pocket. But first, let's clean up this mess and figure out how to cover the window until I can get glass from Omaha. They worked by lamplight, sweeping broken glass into a wooden crate and nailing boards across the window opening. The work gave them something to focus on besides the fear that now lived in the room with them like an unwelcome visitor. As dawn broke over the Nebraska plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Edmund realized that their peaceful weeks of rebuilding the store had been borrowed time. The success that had filled him with hope was exactly what had painted a target on their backs. Who do you think did this? Mei Lin asked as they shared a simple breakfast of bread and jam. Edmund had his suspicions, but accusing someone without proof would only create more problems. Could be anyone who doesn't like change, he said diplomatically. Or anyone who doesn't like us, Li Hua added with the blunt honesty that Edmund had come to expect from her. The morning brought a steady stream of customers, and Edmund watched their faces carefully for any sign of guilt or hostility. Most people expressed genuine shock and concern about the broken window. Mrs. Henderson offered to lend them blankets to hang over the boards. Mr. Watson volunteered to help replace the glass when Edmund could afford it. But a few customers seemed less surprised by the vandalism, and one or two actually seemed pleased. "Shame about your window," said Tom Bradley, a rancher who rarely came to town except when he needed supplies. "Course, when you make certain choices, sometimes there are consequences." The way he emphasized certain choices made Edmund's blood run cold. Bradley wasn't just commenting on the broken window. He was delivering a message. "What kind of consequences?" Edmund asked, his voice carefully neutral. Bradley shrugged, examining a coil of rope with exaggerated interest. "Oh, you know how folks talk. Some say it's not natural for a white man to be living so close with Chinese girls. Makes people wonder about your intentions." The insinuation hit Edmund like a physical blow. He felt his face burn with anger and shame. Not because there was any truth to Bradley's ugly suggestion, but because he realized how easily people could twist his charitable act into something shameful. "Those girls work for me," Edmund said firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." "If you say so," Bradley replied with a smirk that suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "But you might want to think about appearances. Small towns have long memories for scandal." After Bradley left without buying anything, Edmund realized that the broken window was just the beginning. Someone was spreading rumors designed to destroy his reputation and drive the girls away. The attack on his store wasn't random vandalism. It was part of a calculated campaign to force him into abandoning the people who had saved his business. "We heard what that man said," Mei Lin told him during the lunch break. "The rumors about why you keep us here." Edmund felt sick. "You know they're not true." "Of course we know," Li Hua said impatiently. "But other people might believe them, and believing lies can be as dangerous as believing truth." Xiao Yu, who had been unusually quiet all morning, suddenly spoke up. In the wagon train from California, there was a family who helped a Cherokee woman and her children. People started saying bad things about them too. Eventually, they had to choose between helping and being accepted. "What did they choose?" Edmund asked. "They sent the Cherokee family away," Xiao Yu said sadly. "But it didn't help. Once people decide you're different, they don't forgive you for going back to being the same." Her words carried a wisdom that seemed too heavy for someone so young. Edmund realized that these girls had experienced prejudice and persecution in ways he was only beginning to understand. That afternoon, Sheriff Walsh appeared at the store, ostensibly investigating the broken window, but clearly more interested in intimidating than protecting. "Any idea who might want to send you a message?" Walsh asked, examining the boarded-up window with theatrical concern. "Someone who doesn't like successful businesses, I suppose," Edmund replied. Walsh chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Success can be a dangerous thing when it comes at other people's expense." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well, word is you've been pretty aggressive about collecting debts lately, making folks pay up who've been struggling. Some people might see that as taking advantage of your neighbor's hard times." Edmund stared at the sheriff in disbelief. Walsh was twisting the simple act of collecting legitimate debts into something predatory and wrong. "I've been polite and fair with everyone," Edmund said. "Nobody's been forced to pay more than they actually owed." "Maybe so," Walsh replied. "But hiring these foreign girls to do your dirty work, well, that rubs some folks the wrong way. Makes them think you're putting outsiders ahead of your own community." The accusation was so twisted that Edmund almost laughed. The girls had helped him organize his records and clean his store, hardly dirty work, by any reasonable definition. "Sheriff, are you here to investigate a crime or to threaten law-abiding citizens?" Walsh's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "I'm here to maintain peace in this community. Sometimes that means giving folks friendly advice about how to avoid future problems." After Walsh left, Edmund realized that the threat wasn't coming from random troublemakers. It was coming from people in positions of authority who had decided that his success and the girl's presence were somehow threats to the natural order of things. That evening, as they prepared for another night of uncertainty, Mei Lin made an observation that chilled Edmund to the bone. "The sheriff knows who broke your window," she said quietly. "Maybe he didn't throw the brick himself, but he knows who did." Edmund nodded grimly. The investigation was a sham, designed to intimidate rather than solve the crime. They were on their own, facing enemies who had the law on their side and no intention of playing fair. The question was no longer whether trouble would find them again, but when and whether they'd be ready for it. The flames danced against the November sky like demons celebrating destruction, and Edmund knew with sick certainty that his storage shed wasn't burning by accident. He burst through the back door of his store at 2 in the morning, awakened by the smell of smoke and the crackle of burning wood. The small building where he kept extra inventory and winter supplies was completely engulfed, orange tongues of fire licking hungrily at the main store's wooden walls just 20 feet away. "Water! We need water!" he shouted, grabbing the first bucket he could find and running toward the well behind his building. Mei Lin appeared beside him, her nightgown tucked hastily into her day clothes, already carrying 2 more buckets. "Li Hua is moving things away from the store walls," she called over the roar of the flames. "Xiao Yu is checking that the fire hasn't spread to the front." They worked desperately in the orange-tinted darkness, forming a bucket brigade between the well and the burning shed. Edmund's lungs burned from smoke and effort, but he kept moving, knowing that losing the shed was bad enough. Losing the entire store would destroy everything they'd rebuilt together. The volunteer fire brigade arrived 20 minutes later, but by then the shed was nothing but glowing embers and charred timbers. The main store had been saved, though scorch marks on the back wall showed how close they'd come to losing everything. "Started pretty fast for an accidental fire," observed Jake Morrison, the fire brigade captain, as he examined the remains by lantern light. Wood was dry, but not that dry. Edmund wiped soot from his face with a trembling hand. 3 weeks had passed since the broken window, and he'd hoped the worst was over. Now he realized the threats had been escalating toward this moment, a direct attack on his livelihood that could have killed them all if the fire had spread. "Any idea how it started?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Could be anything," Edmund replied carefully. He trusted Morrison, but accusations without proof would only make their situation worse. Li Hua approached them, her face streaked with ash but her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Mr. Morrison, we found something you should see." She led them to a spot near the shed's foundation where the fire hadn't burned as hot. Partially hidden under a collapsed beam lay the remains of what looked like a glass bottle with a piece of cloth stuffed in the neck. "Well, I'll be," Morrison muttered, crouching down for a closer look. "That's not from any accident." Edmund's stomach dropped. Someone had deliberately tried to burn down his store, probably hoping the fire would spread and destroy everything, including the people sleeping inside. "This changes things," Morrison said grimly. "This isn't just vandalism anymore. This is attempted murder." The words hung in the cold November air like visible breath. Edmund looked at the 3 girls who had risked their lives to save his store, and realized that his decision to help them had put them in mortal danger. "We should tell Sheriff Walsh," Morrison continued. "He needs to investigate this properly." Edmund and Mei Lin exchanged glances. They both knew Walsh's idea of investigation would involve blaming the victims rather than catching the real criminals. "Of course," Edmund said, though his heart sank at the thought of facing the sheriff's false sympathy and veiled threats. As the fire brigade packed up their equipment, Edmund surveyed the damage by lantern light. The shed had contained most of his winter inventory: warm clothes, extra blankets, preserved foods, and heating supplies that families would need in the coming months. The financial loss was devastating, but the emotional impact was worse. Someone had tried to kill them, and that someone was still out there, probably planning their next attack. "We can't stay here," Li Hua said quietly as they stood looking at the smoking ruins. "Next time they might succeed. Running away won't solve anything," Mei Lin replied firmly. "These people will just find new targets to blame for their problems." Xiao Yu, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly pointed toward the street. "Someone's watching us." Edmund turned to see a figure standing in the shadows across from his store, barely visible in the darkness between 2 buildings. When the person realized they'd been spotted, They quickly disappeared into the night. "Did you recognize them?" Edmund asked. "Too dark to tell," Xiaoyu replied. "But they were there the whole time we fought the fire. Just watching." The idea that someone had stayed to observe their struggle against the flames they'd set made Edmund's blood boil. The arsonist hadn't just tried to destroy his property. They'd wanted to watch him suffer. Sheriff Walsh arrived the next morning with his usual show of concern and authority. He examined the evidence, questioned Edmund and the girls, and made all the right noises about conducting a thorough investigation. But Edmund could see the calculation in his eyes. Walsh was figuring out how to use this crisis to his advantage rather than solve it. "Mighty convenient that you folks were awake to fight the fire," Walsh observed, making notes in his little book. "Most people would have slept right through until it was too late." The implication was clear. Walsh was suggesting they'd set the fire themselves for some twisted reason. "The smoke woke us up," Edmund said through gritted teeth. "We're lucky we didn't die in our sleep." "Lucky indeed," Walsh agreed, but his tone suggested he thought luck had nothing to do with it. After the sheriff left, promising to look into the matter thoroughly, Edmund realized they were completely on their own. Not only would Walsh not help them, he might actually be working with whoever was behind the attacks. The rest of the day brought a steady stream of visitors, but their reactions revealed the deep divisions in the community. Mrs. Henderson and several other neighbors expressed genuine shock and offered to help however they could. Mr. Watson brought lumber to help repair the damage, and the Miller family donated some of their winter supplies to replace what had been lost. But other visitors came with different messages. "Heard you had some trouble last night," Tom Bradley said, examining the burned shed with obvious satisfaction. "Amazing how fast a fire can spread when you're not careful." "We were careful," Edmund replied. "Someone set this fire deliberately." Bradley shrugged. "Hard to prove something like that. Could have been anything. Maybe some of those Chinese lanterns they use for their heathen ceremonies." The accusation was so outrageous that Edmund almost lost his temper. "They don't use lanterns for ceremonies, and even if they did, we were all asleep when the fire started." "If you say so," Bradley replied with the same maddening smirk he'd worn during his previous visit. "But folks are starting to wonder if maybe these problems started when certain changes were made around here." After Bradley left, Edmund realized the arson had served a double purpose. Not only had it destroyed his property and threatened their lives, but it gave the perpetrators a chance to spread more rumors about the girls being responsible for their own persecution. That evening, as they ate a simple dinner by lamplight in the smoke-damaged store, Mei Lin made an observation that changed everything. "The person who threw the fire bottle knew exactly where you kept your winter inventory," she said thoughtfully. "They didn't just want to burn down any building. They wanted to destroy the specific things you needed to stay in business through the cold months." Edmund paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. She was right. The shed had contained the most valuable and irreplaceable items in his entire stock. Someone with detailed knowledge of his business operations had targeted the attack for maximum damage. "Who knows what you keep where?" Li Hua asked. Edmund thought about it carefully. Regular customers might know the general layout of his store, but only a few people knew exactly what he stored in the back shed. The list was frighteningly short, and included at least one person he'd never suspected of being capable of such violence. The revelation that their enemy might be someone he trusted as a friend hit Edmund harder than all the previous attacks combined. But it also gave them something they'd lacked before, a starting point for fighting back. The question was whether they were brave enough to confront the truth, even if it meant discovering that their enemy wore a familiar face. McKinnon's saloon fell silent when Mei Lin pushed through the swinging doors, her small frame casting a long shadow across the sawdust-covered floor as every man inside turned to stare in shock. No Chinese person had ever entered the saloon before, let alone a young woman who should have been safely hidden away from the rough world of gambling, drinking, and frontier justice. But Mei Lin walked straight toward the bar where Sheriff Walsh sat with Tom Bradley and two other men, her back straight and her chin raised with the same dignity she'd shown at the auction house. "Sheriff Walsh," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. "We need to discuss the fire." Walsh's face went through several changes. Surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear before settling into cold authority. You don't belong in here, girl. Get out before something bad happens. Something bad already happened, Mei Lin replied calmly. Someone tried to burn down our home. Someone who knew exactly where Mr. Pierce kept his most valuable inventory. Edmund entered the saloon behind her, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and terror. They'd planned this confrontation carefully, but seeing Mei Lin face down a room full of hostile men made him want to grab her and run for safety. The lady asked you a question, Sheriff, Edmund said, moving to stand beside Mei Lin. Are you going to investigate the arson? Or do we need to take our concerns to the territorial authorities? The threat of outside law enforcement hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Walsh's face darkened, but before he could respond, Tom Bradley laughed harshly. Territorial authorities? For what? Some Chinese girl's wild accusations. For attempted murder, Li Hua said from the saloon entrance, where she stood with Xiao Yu and several other people who had followed them from the store. That's what happens when you try to burn down a building with people sleeping inside. Edmund was amazed to see Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Watson, and the Miller family filing into the saloon behind the girls. Apparently word had spread about their plan to confront Walsh publicly, and some of their supporters had decided to show up as witnesses. This is ridiculous, Walsh sputtered, looking around the crowded saloon with growing unease. I'm conducting a proper investigation. Really? Mei Lin asked, pulling a piece of paper from her coat pocket. Then perhaps you can explain why your boot print was found in the mud near our burned shed. She unfolded a careful drawing that Li Hua had made, showing the distinctive pattern of marks left by Walsh's boots in the soft earth around the fire site. The drawing was detailed enough to match specific wear patterns and damage to the sole. That could be anyone's boot, Bradley protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Size 10, with a distinctive chip in the left heel where the boot hit something sharp, Xiao Yu said, stepping forward to point out details in the drawing. Just like the boots Sheriff Walsh is wearing right now. The saloon erupted in muttered conversations as people examined Walsh's feet and compared them to the drawing. The sheriff's face went pale as he realized how much evidence the girls had gathered against him. Even if I was there, Walsh said desperately, that doesn't prove anything. I'm the sheriff, of course. I investigated the fire scene. At 2 in the morning? Edmund asked. Before anyone reported the fire? That's interesting timing for an investigation. Mrs. Henderson pushed forward through the crowd, her elderly frame somehow commanding respect from men twice her size. Sheriff Walsh, I've known you since you were a boy pulling pranks behind the church. But this isn't a prank anymore. This is serious business. Mrs. Henderson, you don't understand, Walsh began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. I understand perfectly. You've been trying to drive these good people out of town because you don't like change. But setting fires crosses a line that no decent person crosses. They're not decent people, Bradley exploded, his careful facade finally cracking. They're foreigners who don't belong here, taking jobs from honest Americans and corrupting our community. What jobs? Li Hua asked with devastating logic. We work in Mr. Pierce's store. We don't take jobs from anyone. You take customers from other businesses, Bradley shot back. You undercut honest merchants with your foreign ways. We provide good service at fair prices, Mei Lin replied. If that hurts other businesses, perhaps they should improve their own service instead of burning down their competition. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Edmund realized that Bradley had just revealed more than he'd intended. The attacks weren't just about prejudice. They were about business competition. Tom, Mr. Watson said slowly, do you have something to tell us about that fire? Bradley looked around the saloon, realizing that the mood had shifted against him. What had started as a confrontation with vulnerable outsiders had become a community reckoning with its own conscience. I didn't set any fire, he muttered, but his eyes wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. But you know who did, Xiao Yu said with the startling insight that always surprised adults. And you know why. The young girl's direct question pierced through Bradley's defenses like a knife through paper. His face crumpled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. My store is failing, he admitted finally. Has been for months. When Pierce's place started thriving again, taking customers I used to count on, I couldn't compete with their prices and service. So you decided to burn us out instead of improving your business, Edmund said, his voice heavy with disappointment rather than anger. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone, Bradley said miserably. Just the shed. Just enough to set you back so things could go back to the way they were. The way they were was me failing and you succeeding, Edmund pointed out. Now I'm succeeding and you're failing. The difference is, I'm not trying to burn down your store. The simple truth of his statement seemed to hit Bradley like a physical blow. He looked around the saloon at faces that had once shown him respect and saw only disappointment and disgust. Sheriff Walsh, realizing that his co-conspirator had just confessed, tried one last desperate play. Even if Tom made a mistake, he said, that doesn't change the fact that these Chinese girls don't belong in our community. They're a disruption to our way of life. Our way of life includes helping neighbors and treating people fairly, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. If you can't do that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The crowd murmured agreement, and Edmund realized that something fundamental had changed in the saloon. What had started as a confrontation between outcasts and authority had become a community choosing its values over its prejudices. Walsh looked around the room, seeing his authority crumble before his eyes. Without another word, he pushed through the crowd and out of the saloon, leaving behind his badge and his credibility. Bradley followed him out, his shoulders slumped in defeat. In the silence that followed, Mr. Watson cleared his throat. I reckon we need a new sheriff, he said. And I reckon we need to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Agreed, Mrs. Henderson said. And I think we owe these young ladies an apology for not standing up to this nonsense sooner. As the crowd began to disperse, people stopped to shake Edmund's hand and speak kindly to the girls. Not everyone was convinced, but enough had changed their minds to shift the balance of power in the community. Outside the saloon, Mei Lin looked up at Edmund with a small smile. Your Martha would be proud, she said simply. Edmund nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying since the day Martha died. For the first time in months, he felt like he was the man she'd married, someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The store would need repairs, and there would always be people who resented change. But they'd won something more valuable than a building or a business. They'd won the right to call this place home, and the knowledge that home wasn't about where you came from, but about the people who chose to stand beside you when standing became difficult. As they walked back through the November evening toward their damaged but still standing store, Edmund realized that his impulsive purchase at the auction had given him more than 3 workers. It had given him a family, and a chance to become the man Martha had always believed he could be. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time since Martha's death, Edmund looked forward to facing it.